Okay, so have you ever heard of a patrol boat purchase causing like a national uproar? We're doing a deep dive today into a Supreme Court case that went totally viral in the Philippines. It's this case where handwritten changes on some official documents
Hmm.
became like a symbol of something way bigger.
Yeah, it is fascinating how something like buying a patrol boat, which sounds pretty straightforward, can spiral into all these accusations and conflicting claims and legal battles. I mean, this case really shows how complex these procurement processes are and how important transparency and accountability are within the government.
Right, you'd think getting a patrol boat would be pretty simple, but
Hmm.
this case, GR No. 215985, decided on November 11, 2021, proves it's anything but simple. We're talking like altered contracts and ghost deliveries and just so many questions about how things went so wrong.
Yeah, and what's so interesting here is how this routine need for a patrol boat by the province of Bataan's anti-illegal fishing task force turned into this huge legal mess. They had a budget and a plan for a six-cylinder engine boat, so like what could go wrong?
Well, a lot, apparently. From what I read, the bidding process itself was kind of a mess.
Yeah, the initial public bidding didn't get any qualified bidders. And then, instead of sticking to the approved limited source bidding, the Bids and Awards Committee, or BAC, decided to go with a negotiated procurement process.
So they basically went off script. Was that even allowed?
That's a key issue here. They went against the approved procedure and they invited three people to submit bids. But these people weren't exactly boat building experts. One was mostly a fisherman, another was a carpenter, and the third one did some boat repairs. None of them had registered businesses. Oh, and to make things even worse, two of them later said they never even participated in the bidding process.
Wait, hold on. So we have possibly unqualified bidders,
Yeah.
and they're using an unauthorized procurement method. This is already sounding like a disaster waiting to happen.
Yeah, it is. And it gets even more complicated. So the contract was awarded to one of these guys for a way lower price than the initial budget. Then later on, handwritten changes show up on the documents after the contract's been awarded, changing the boat from a six-cylinder engine to a four-cylinder one.
Handwritten changes. That sounds a little suspicious.
Yeah, the reason they gave was that the budget wasn't enough for a six-cylinder engine anymore, but they changed it after the contract was awarded for a six-cylinder boat. It's a classic example of a material amendment, a big change that affects the whole contract. And that wasn't the only problem. The supplier said he delivered the boat in January and got paid in February, and that it took him weeks to build it. But some officials said it was a ghost delivery, meaning it never actually happened.
Hold on. So they paid the guy before he even built the boat, and the boat was supposedly delivered before it was paid for. What did the lower court say about all of this?
Well, the regional trial court initially dismissed the charges against the BAC members and the other officials. Then the Court of Appeals agreed with that decision, saying there wasn't proof of bad faith or that they were biased. But then the Ombudsman appealed to the Supreme Court.
And I guess the Supreme Court saw things differently.
They did. The Supreme Court had one main question to figure out. Did what these officials do count as grave misconduct and serious dishonesty? They looked at all the evidence really carefully, focusing on how they didn't follow the right procurement method, how there weren't any qualified bidders, how they changed the contract in a big way, and whether the delivery actually happened.
So what was their decision?
The Supreme Court overturned what the lower court said and found the BAC members, the person who approved it, and even the inspecting officer guilty of grave misconduct and dishonesty.
Wow, guilty on all counts. What does that even mean, though? Like, what happens because of those charges?
That's what we'll look at next. We're going to break down exactly what grave misconduct and serious dishonesty mean in this case and see what the consequences of all this are. It really shows how even something that seems like a small purchase can have huge consequences if it's not done right.
Okay, so we just finished talking about those guilty verdicts for grave misconduct and serious dishonesty. Those are some pretty serious charges. Can you explain what those actually mean, like, in this situation?
Yeah, grave misconduct here means it's more than just messing up. The BAC members and whoever approved this intentionally broke the procurement law, and they meant to do it.
So it's not like they just made a mistake. They knew they were breaking the rules.
Exactly. And serious dishonesty goes even further. That means they were trying to trick people, probably to get something for themselves. Think about those fake bidders and that weird ghost delivery and how they paid for the boat before it was even built. It seems like they were trying to hide what was really going on.
And remember those two bidders that said they had nothing to do with it? That's where things get really interesting, right? How did the court prove that those bids were fake, and what does that tell us about this whole thing?
Yeah, that's a really important point. Those two guys swore they never submitted any bids. They weren't even in the boat building business. The court found out that their signatures on the bidding documents were forged.
So someone was trying to make it look like there was real competition when there wasn't any.
Exactly. The court said this is a big part of why they decided there was serious dishonesty. It shows that they were totally ignoring the law about having a fair and open bidding process.
Wow, it's crazy how this whole thing started with just buying a patrol boat, and now it's this huge mess with all this lying and stuff. Before we talk about what happened to these guys because of all this, I think it's helpful to understand the legal stuff the Supreme Court used to make their decision. Can you tell us about that?
Of course. The court talked about a few important legal ideas, starting with competitive bidding. That's like a super important part of how the government buys things because it makes sure everything's fair and open and that the taxpayers are getting the best deal.
So it's kind of like a level playing field, so everyone has a chance to offer their stuff.
Right. That way, no one gets special treatment and they don't just give contracts to their buddies. The BAC has to follow this rule. It's the law.
And obviously they didn't do that here. Okay, what about those other ways they could have bought the boat? Like the negotiated procurement thing they used.
Yeah, that's where it gets kind of tricky. The law says they can only use those other methods in certain situations, and this wasn't one of them. First, they needed permission from the head of the procuring entity to do something different than the limited source bidding that was already approved, but they just skipped that step.
So they were already in trouble even before those fake bidders showed up.
Yep. And even if they had gotten permission, they still messed up the negotiated procurement process. The law says they have to do it the same way as a public bidding, which they didn't.
And then there's that thing with the handwritten change from the six-cylinder engine to the four-cylinder one. That's what they call a material amendment, right?
You got it. A material amendment is any change to a contract that changes the important parts of it, like switching what kind of engine it has and how much it costs. The court was really clear about this. You can't make a big change like that after you've already said who's getting the contract.
So it's not just a small change. It makes the whole process invalid.
Right. It messes up the whole bidding thing, and it's not fair to other people who might have wanted to bid. Imagine you bid on a contract to provide a six-cylinder engine, and then after you win, they tell you it's actually for a four-cylinder one. That's a huge difference, and that's why the court thought it was such a big deal.
This is starting to sound like one of those Scooby-Doo episodes where the mystery is the ghost patrol boat. But getting those guilty verdicts has real consequences. What happened to the people who were found guilty?
Oh, yeah. The Supreme Court didn't mess around. They said that the BAC members, the provincial administrator, and the inspecting officer were all fired from their government jobs.
Wow, they got fired. That's a big deal. What happens to their careers after something like this?
Yeah, and it gets even worse. They also can't hold public office anymore. They lose their retirement benefits, and they can't even take the civil service exams again.
That's a lot of punishment. Some people might think it's too much for just buying a patrol boat the wrong way. What do you think?
Yeah, it might seem like a lot at first, but it wasn't just about how much the boat cost. This case was about people trusting the government, and they showed they didn't care about the law at all. The Supreme Court wanted to make it really clear that this was wrong and to stop other people from doing the same thing in the future.
So it's not just about punishing these guys. It's about making sure people can trust the government.
Exactly. The court said the point of punishing people in the government isn't just to get back at them. It's about making the government work better and making people believe in it. They wanted to show people that the government is serious about doing things the right way.
This case really shows how even something small, like buying a patrol boat, can become grave misconduct if you totally ignore the law, and that can make people stop trusting the government.
Definitely. When we look closely at all these laws and rules about procurement, it's clear that the government has to be transparent and do things by the book. Things that might seem like just technicalities can actually have a big impact on whether public money is being used fairly and efficiently.
Before we finish up, I'm curious about the inspecting officer. What did he do that was wrong?
Well, he was a big part of why that ghost delivery happened. He signed a paper saying that the patrol boat was delivered and inspected back in January 2006, even though it's obvious that couldn't have happened. The court said he was guilty of both grave misconduct and serious dishonesty because he either knew it wasn't true and signed it anyway, or He didn't even bother to check if it was true.
It just shows that everyone involved has to be responsible for what they do.
Right. This case shows that even the people who are supposed to be checking things can be part of doing something wrong. It means we need to have really good ways to keep things in check at every step of the way.
This is a perfect example of why we do these deep dives. It's easy to just read the headlines and not really understand what's going on. But when you look at all the details, you learn so much about how things actually work in the government, or in this case, how they sometimes don't work.
I totally agree. It's all about connecting the dots and figuring out what it all means. And sometimes what it means is bigger than the story itself. But before I get to the last part, here's one thing I'm still wondering about. What about the other two people involved in buying this boat? You said before that the court dismissed the cases against them, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're off the hook. Can you explain that a little more?
Right, so we were talking about those two other officials who were also involved in this patrol boat purchase, but had their cases dismissed. Can you remind me who they were and why those cases were dismissed?
Oh, yeah, sure. Those were the provincial agriculturist and the provincial accountant. They were involved in this whole scheme, but not in the exact same way as the BAC members, the provincial administrator, and the inspecting officer. The court dismissed their cases because they said there wasn't enough evidence to prove they were guilty of grave misconduct or serious dishonesty.
So even though buying the patrol boat was illegal, they had to look at each person individually and see if there was enough proof to charge them.
Yeah, that's right. It shows that even when there's a big scheme going on, the law still looks at what each person did and whether there's enough evidence to prove they did something wrong.
Okay, that makes sense. So we talked about the rules they broke and how they were found guilty and how messing up even a small purchase can get you in big trouble. But we haven't really talked about what happened after all this. What are the long-term effects of this case, both for the people involved and for the government in general?
Well, the impact is pretty big. For the people who are found guilty, the consequences are serious. They lost their jobs, and they have to deal with all these other penalties that will affect their careers and whether they can ever work for the government again. It shows that if you break the public's trust, there are serious consequences.
It seems like the Supreme Court really wanted to make an example out of them.
Oh, yeah, definitely. They wanted to send a strong message that nobody's above the law, not even important government officials. The court said it's really important to make sure that the government spends money fairly and openly and honestly.
This whole case is like a lesson in how not to buy stuff for the government.
But besides what happened to those individuals, what about the bigger picture? What does this case tell us about the need for better safeguards and oversight in government procurement processes?
This case really shows that there are weaknesses in the system and that we need to do a better job of making sure things are being done correctly. It's like a wake-up call saying we need better checks and balances, tougher punishments for people who break the rules, and more transparency so this doesn't happen again.
So what would that look like in practice?
Well, it could mean giving more power to auditing agencies, making the penalties for breaking the rules even tougher, and making sure the public understands how the procurement process works. It's about making sure everyone's accountable and that every step is looked at carefully. So if something's wrong, it gets caught right away.
It also makes you think about how important whistleblowers are. If somebody hadn't said something, would we even know about any of this? That's a great point. Whistleblowers are really important because they can expose what's going on and make sure that people in power are held responsible. It takes a lot of courage to speak up, but as we see in this case, it can make a huge difference in making sure the law is followed.
It reminds us that we all have a responsibility to make sure the government is doing things the right way. We can't just assume everything's fine. We need to be informed and involved and speak up if something seems off.
Exactly. This case shows us that we need to pay attention to what the government's doing, ask questions, and demand that the people we trust with our money are doing their jobs properly.
This deep dive has been really eye-opening. It's easy to get lost in all the legal details, but you've helped us understand what it all means and see the bigger picture. So what are some key takeaways that our listeners should keep in mind?
This case shows that even the things the government does every day can have huge consequences if they're not done right. It shows how important it is for the government to be open and honest in everything they do. Even things that seem like just technicalities can actually have a big impact on making sure public money is being used fairly and in a way that makes sense.
It also shows that justice can happen even when powerful people are involved. The fact that this case went all the way to the Supreme Court and that those who abused their power were found guilty shows that our justice system is strong and fair.
And lastly, it's a call to action for all of us to be more involved citizens. Stay informed, ask questions, and don't be afraid to speak up if you see something that's not right.
This is exactly why we do the deep dive, to look deeper than just the headlines, understand complex issues, and give our listeners the knowledge and information they need to be informed citizens.
I couldn't agree more. It's about helping people understand how things work in our government, both the good and the bad, so we can all work together to make society fairer and more just.
Well said. And for everyone listening who loves a good mystery, here's something to think about. Could there be more to this story than we know? Was this just a one-time thing, or is it a sign of a bigger problem? Let us know what you think. Leave a comment and tell us what stood out to you. And if you want to hear more deep dives into interesting legal cases and news stories, hit that subscribe button.